Hello, beautiful people, and thanks for joining me in this part number. I've lost count since we've done quite a few of these already. Number 23, part 23 of this long journey that we have titled The Journey. And today's chapter, just as a reminder, we are in the first book that we are talking in a series of 5, and this is the book Patriarchs and Prophets. We are on chapter 23, and the chapter 23 is titled The Plagues of Egypt. So in the last chapter, we talked about Moses, and we basically took the story of Moses all the way up until the point that God asks Moses to go back to Egypt because he needs him to, with the help of God, deliver God's people, the people of Israel, out of Egypt, out of the bondage to the Egyptians. Because the labor that the Egyptians were imposing on the Israelites was harsh, and the people of God claimed upon his name, and as the good father that he is, he listened. So this chapter 23, the plagues of Egypt, picks up right when Moses joins his brother Aaron, and they go into the palace of Pharaoh to ask the Pharaoh to release the people of God. And this particular chapter is part 1 of a 2-part series, and that's because in the book, this chapter talks about up until the way of the 9th plague that God sent upon Egypt, and then the next chapter picks up on the very last plague that God sent upon Egypt. So we will get started. As a reminder, this is to be studied along with the Bible. This is just to complement the Bible, not to substitute Bible study. And this particular chapter today is based on Exodus 5 to 10. So in the Bible, the book of Exodus, chapters 5 to 10. So here we go. So Moses and Aaron go into the Pharaoh's, palace, and they go in and ask, the God has sent us, the God of Israel has sent us, the one true God had sent us, and we are here to deliver our people, to, get the people out of Egypt. So something very interesting here is that Pharaoh, right off the bat, he takes a defiance position, and he says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor I will let Israel go." So from the very beginning, Pharaoh takes a position of defiance against the God of the heavens. And, it's just sad to see how people can be so disrespectful towards the God of the heavens. And of course, Pharaoh definitely had it coming for him, to say the least. But the first lesson that this chapter talks about that is super important is we gotta remember that the people back in the Jacob's time, when Jacob came into Egypt and they were given the land of Goshen, the best of the land, it wasn't God's plan for them to stay in Egypt forever. And this is perhaps another topic, but they liked the land. Of course, it was the best that Egypt had to offer. They liked the land. They like, the commodities of the city. And if there's something we've learned over and over with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, God is constantly calling out his people with Lot out of the cities and into the mountains, into the nature. He wants to retreat his people to retreat away from the city, because usually in the cities is, where sin abounds, and in this particular time there was a lot of idolatry. So the people of Israel liked Egypt, stayed in Egypt, and because of it they spent there over 400 years basically captive in a strange land, because it was not, God's plan was never for them to stay there for that long. So, as you can imagine, 400 years living in Egypt, the Israelites had definitely picked up some bad habits and were definitely practicing some sins. So it's something really curious to me how, and a lesson for us how serious God is about his requirements and his law. This is what Ellen White writes. In their bondage, the Israelites had to some extent lost the knowledge of God's law, and they had departed from its precepts. The Sabbath had been generally disregarded, and the exactions of their taskmakers made its observance apparently impossible. But Moses had shown his people that obedience to God was the first condition of deliverance, and the efforts made to restore the observance of the Sabbath had come to the notice of their oppressors. So, even though they had been there 400 years, it was clear in God's mind that in order for God to be able to help them, they needed to follow His commandments. And His commandments, His law, we know that is entirely based on love. The sin was the introduction of selfishness into the world. The law of God is in harmony with love, with His nature. So in order for God to be able to help them, they needed to get back into honoring God's commandments and God's requirements. And it's important that it mentions the Sabbath here because it's usually the fourth commandment that is in Exodus 20 is remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And it's the one commandment that uses the word remember, and it's generally the commandment that we often or most often forget about. So as Moses going to Pharaoh and he asked him to release his people, and by this point he had met with the elders of Israel, and they felt like, okay, God is going to take us out of here. So now they start observing the Sabbath, so they are not working on the Sabbath, and the Egyptians are taking note, and now Pharaoh is like, okay, these people are starting to look lazy and they're gonna revolt against us, so I'm gonna make their work harsher. So, and this is what we talked last time of display and counterplay of God and Satan. You gotta remember that behind the scenes, Satan is working. He doesn't want to let the people of Israel go. He knows from prophecy that out of the descendants of Judah, Jesus was going to come in the future. This is Genesis chapter 45, verse 10 or so. So he doesn't want to let the Israelites go. So he, influences Pharaoh to make now the work even harsher. And what this triggers is, as you can imagine, if the people of Israel were being forced now to work more, now they don't want to follow God's commandments. They're like, no, we gotta get back to work. We gotta keep the things the way they were because they're getting worse. And this is usually what happens with every single Christian in the planet that takes a stand for God. Things usually and generally get a bit harder before they start feeling easier. When a person gives his heart to Jesus and stay away from drugs for a moment, those drugs call the people. When people leave pornography calls the people. It's hard. It feels hard to leave those bad traits behind. And, we just got to push through with the help of God and the Holy Spirit. So this is what was happening to them. Now their work was harder, but they still needed to, if they wanted, to get out of Egypt, to honor God. So it's this decision of, do I follow the laws of man or do I follow the laws of God? So in bitterness, of course, they were bitter. They cried, to Moses, and they're like, hey, Moses, like, what is going on? Like, you came to give us more work. They were frustrated with him. And Moses goes and talks to God, and he's like, God, what is going on? You are all powerful. Why is Pharaoh doing this? He's frustrated. And that is lesson number 2. As we study the life of Moses in the Bible, you'll see that Moses' prayers were pretty strong. And he was probably even swearing in the Hebrew language. He was very frustrated. He was impatient. He was, overwhelmed. And he expressed that to God, and that was okay. So sometimes people have this impression that when we pray, we have to be super careful about what we say or how we feel, or no. Prayer is the act of opening your heart to God as to a friend. So Moses embodies this. Moses' prayers with God were prayers of frustration. Why is this happening? What do you want me to do? Why did you even brought me here if you were going to make these people work more? That's what Moses' prayer was. But of course, God says, don't worry, it'll all be okay. You will get to see. So he goes back to Pharaoh with Aaron, and then Pharaoh asks for a signal, and this is the story where Moses throws his rod into the ground and it turns into a serpent. But then the magicians of Pharaoh do the same, and Ellen White here clarifies, Satan does not have the power to create life, but he does have the power to create an illusion of life. So in the Bible we read that the serpents that came out of the rod of Moses ate those of the magicians of Egypt, meaning God is more powerful. But because of the illusion that the magicians could do this in Egypt, Pharaoh, of course, hardened his heart and was like, our gods are as powerful as yours. We're not going to let the people of Israel go. So things, obviously continue to get worse. So at this point is where God tells Moses, you know what, I am going to send plagues to Egypt. And there's a line here that I highlighted in this chapter. I'm even going to show you. It's right here. Because it's so beautiful how God operates. And I'm going to read it. And this is when God told Moses about the plagues. He says, before the infliction of each plague, Moses was to describe its nature and effects, that the king might save himself from it if he chose. So God was not trying to surprise Pharaoh and destroy his kingdom and make him feel miserable. That's not how God works. God loved Pharaoh. Believe it or not, God loved Pharaoh just as much as he loves you and every single human being that has walked this planet. God has never the intention to hurt anyone, but God cannot intermingle or protect someone when the decisions of that someone are of self-harm. So he gives us the options. He tells us, hey, this is what's going on. This is what will happen. And it's really up to you if you choose to remain on that course or you want to change it. That is the Christian life right there. And that's how God operates. So Moses was to tell Pharaoh what would happen if he didn't before the plague actually came. That's a little detail that is not entirely clear from the Bible, but Ellen clarifies it. And it does make perfect sense and harmony with how God operates throughout the entire Bible. So Pharaoh, of course, says no, and here comes the plague. So the first plague is the blood in the waters, in the rivers of Egypt. And here's where God starts showing the Egyptians how useless were the Egyptians' gods. So the Egyptians considered the river Nile to be a superpower, a deity almost, and it says that Pharaoh went there every day to pay homage to the river. So the first thing that, the first plague was that the waters turned into blood and all the fish died, and you can just imagine the strong, disgusting smell that came out of those waters, the same waters that they worshipped in the past and thought they were powerful. Now here is God turning them to blood, meaning your gods and your deities can do nothing to prevent it. Pharaoh feels bad about it. He says to Moses, there's nothing he can do, but his magicians go again and apparently recreate the blood scene. And he said, okay, my gods can do the same. Nothing happened. So we go to plague number 2. The Egyptians worship frogs. And plague number 2, you guessed it, it was an abundance of frogs. There were frogs all over the land. And, frogs might be nice to see one or two crossing the street, but when you have hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of them in the streets, in your house, everywhere that you look, perhaps they're not as nice to have around. And this is what they have. They worship the frogs, and now the frogs were over invading their land, and of course this is not a pleasant experience. So once again, God is taking hit at what the Egyptians considered to be deities. So Pharaoh says, I feel bad, I'm sorry, tells Moses to please ask God to remove these frogs, and all the frogs died. He didn't remove them, but all the frogs died, and they weren't bothering much, but you can imagine again the stank that the dead bodies generated. But even after this happened, Pharaoh still hardened his heart once the frogs died, and he said, I'm not going to let Israel go. So here comes plague number 3, which is lice. And you can imagine the uncomfortableness of having lice all over the place. And this one was one that the magicians of Egypt could not reproduce. So definitely showing that the God of the Israelites was the one true God. Once again, Pharaoh feels bad and he tells Moses, you know what, I'm sorry, I will let you guys go. Moses prayed, asked God to take the lice away, but Pharaoh still doesn't let the people go. And here I highlighted a sentence that was for me very beautiful. We got to remember that the Israelites lived within Egypt, but in the land of Goshen. And it says, as had been foretold, this visitation, talking about the third plague, did not extend to the land of Goshen. So God always protects his people. And we can see that in the story of the plagues. So once again, Pharaoh doesn't want to let the people go. Here comes plague number 5. And this is basically the death of the cattle of the Egyptians. And livestock in those times represented wealth. So without the cattle, there was significantly huge economical loss to the country. And once again, Ellen White's right, of the livestock of the children of Israel, not one of them died. Once again, God protecting his. Pharaoh still doesn't want to let the people go. Here comes plague number 6. And this was boils in the skin of people. And this, of course, is not a pleasant experience. Every animal had it, every person had it, every living thing in Egypt, except for the Israelites, suffered from this plague. Once again, Pharaoh said, I'm sorry, I will let you guys go. Tell God to take this away. Moses prays, this goes away, and still Pharaoh doesn't want to let the people go. So here, I highlighted this particular sentence here. It says, God speaks to man through his servants, giving cautions and warnings and rebuking sin. He gives to each opportunity to correct his errors before they become fixed in the character. But if one refuses to be corrected, divine power does not interpose to counteract the tendency of his own action. So this is talking about Pharaoh. God was not hardening his heart. God had nothing to do with how Pharaoh was responding to the situation. But certainly Pharaoh he had free will, and he was refusing to do what God was asking through Moses. And God, at this point, could do nothing. He was living the consequences of his own decisions. Once again, another plague hits Egypt. This is plague number 7, and hail came out of heaven. Huge hail like the land had never seen before. And this, killed people that were on the street, animals that were outside. It was a huge catastrophe. And hail actually, you can imagine this huge hail falling from the sky. So it will probably destroy part of the city, if not significant part of it. Once again, the land of Goshen was left untouched. Pharaoh says, I'm sorry, everything's going to go away. But Pharaoh once again hardened his heart and decided to not let the children of Israel go. So, plague number 8. And plague number 8 was locusts. And you know from locusts that they eat the greenery. So all the plants, the agricultural sector throughout Egypt took a severe hit. Once again, now they didn't have animals, they had lost life, now they were losing their agricultural produce. Egypt was taking a huge catastrophic blow to the infrastructure of the city out of the stubbornness of this Pharaoh. Once again, he says he's sorry. God takes the locusts away, but here comes again, and he does not want to leave the people of Israel go. At some point, he did consider and told Moses, you know what, just go, take only the men, and the women and the children will stay here, because Pharaoh was hoping that they will go out, and then of course the men wouldn't want to leave their wives behind, so they will return. But Moses told, no, we will go, all of us together, children and men and women, and we will all go out and serve God. But Pharaoh didn't want this. So plague number 9, and this is the last plague of this chapter before the next chapter, that is part 2. And plague number 9 was a darkness. The sun just didn't come out. It was constant and absolute palpable, is that the word, palpable darkness. You could not see people's faces even if you were standing within a feet from them. And he says the sun and the moon were objects of worship to the Egyptians. In this mysterious darkness, the people under gods alike were struck by the power that had undertaken the cause of the bondmen. So once again, God is striking what the Egyptians considered to be deities, just to show that their deities were completely useless, and that only the God of Israel, the one true living God, was God. And this is where it ends, plague number 9. And if you've read the story of Moses, you know that the plague that's missing, it's the worst of them all, and the last one that fell upon Egypt. And we will touch that next time we meet. Few lessons here to recap. First, it is extremely important to be honest and open with God in prayer. It is completely okay to be, to express what you feel to God. After all, God does know everything, and he does know how you feel. So even if you think it, he knows, so why not say it and share it with him? And second, God will come to the rescue of his people, but his people need to follow and obey his commandments. It's a contract of love, and we have to look at the law that God provides us as the law of God, as his nature. And the way that humanity, if everybody will abide by, will be a very peaceful and loving planet to live in. And third, God protects his people. Throughout all of these plagues, the Israelites in the land of Goshen were untouched. They were, living happily, while the Egyptians were going through this horrible plagues and, ruins that came upon the city. So 3 lessons there. Thank you for joining. Don't forget, meet me next time so that we can talk about the next chapter, which is the last plague in Egypt. Thank you for joining, and until next one.